Okay, folks, and welcome to the punk philosopher's take on Newcomb's problem. Now, I'm going to be using these props to demonstrate what Newcomb's problem is. I'm going to be talking about Newcomb's problem coming out of a Newcomb's game, and I'll be using these boxes here to show you exactly what that means. However, after that, I'm not really using the visual component of the vlog too much, so especially if you already know what Newcomb's problem is, you can toddle off and do the dishes. However, later, I'm going to be substituting monetary amounts for use values. And I'll be using the props again, so you might want to come back and look at that if you're doing domestic chores, which I completely approve of in terms of negating the difference between philosophy and domesticity. So certainly I am going to promise you an unusual take on Newcomb's problem. I'll eventually come to call it Newcomb's paradox, but I will have to earn that right. I will earn the right to hail unknown beings that pass by me and gather in the distance, and we'll see what that might mean. It's a quote from a poem, which I'll put right at the end of my vlog references, because I'm going to put other references and links that are more relevant to Newcomb's problem first. Okay, what is Newcomb's problem? Imagine you go into a fortune teller's tent and there you find two boxes and a fortune teller. Now, one of the boxes is transparent, that's box A. In order to simulate transparency, I've cut a hole in that box, and you can see in that box $1,000. As it transpires, you can take that $1,000 at any time during the Newcomb's game. So that's there. Now the other box is opaque, hence there's no hole cut, and there's $1 million in it, or not. What do I mean, or not? Well, in the tent is a Predictor character, and she says to you, look, if you exercise some restraint and just take this box, then there'll be $1 million in that box, in that opaque box. But if you try to be greedy and grab the extra 1,000, well, I'm a really accurate predictor. I know you're going to do that, so I won't have put the $1 million in box B. You know she's got a good track record. So then what are you going to do? Are you going to trust her and just go for the million? Or are you going to think, well, look, there's $1,000 that I don't want to leave on the table. Now, when this problem was first introduced to the academic philosophical community by Robert Nozick, and I'll put a reference to his article and hopefully a PDF that you can just get, in 1969, he introduced it in terms of two decision principles coming into conflict, that is dominance and expected utility. By the way, he encountered it at a cocktail party, and it's actually due to Newcomb. So yeah, maybe cocktail parties were more fun then, or at least it was more fun going to cocktail parties in the late 60s than it is hanging out with sports bet in pubs in 2024. And we can come back to the whole question of sports bet. Okay, before we do, so he suggested that there were these two principles, dominance and expected utility. Now, expected utility is pretty straightforward. What happens with expected utility is that you multiply the chance of you getting the desired outcome by a quantification of that outcome itself. So let's say you've got a 90% chance of getting $100 and the expected utility is 90. Let's say you've got an 80% chance of getting $500, then the expected utility is 400. And so you can rank your expected utilities. Now, in the case of the 90% chance of getting 100 versus the 80% chance of getting 500, even though there's less chance of getting the 500, there's more money involved, and so as a result the expected utility is higher. And usually what happens is that dominance and expected utility don't come apart. The reason why not? Well, because dominance is the idea that you just take the best option. In the case of, say, the 90% of 100 and the 80% of 500, that would be the 80% of 500. So usually the two coincide, but in a Newcomb's problem, they don't. And this leads you to have to make a choice between one boxing or two boxing. With one boxing, you go with expected utility, and you just trust the predictor and take the 1 million. Why do you do that? Well, because with expected utility, let's say the predictor is maybe even only 70% accurate, then 70% of 1 million is going to be more than 30% of 1,001,000. The mathematics is slightly more complicated, and I'll put a link down below, but I think you get the idea here that expected utility suggests you one box. On the other hand, dominance, which is just about taking the best possible bet, says, well, you should two box because you're $1,000 better off two boxing, and who wants to leave $1,000 on the table? And so in this way, Newcomb managed to, with his thought experiment in game theory, managed to drive a wedge between dominance and expected utility. Now, why is this about game theory? Well, because you've got two players. You've got an agent who wants to take get as much money for himself as he can, and you've got the predictor, and she is interested in being accurate. And so we've got a two-player game, and we've got a thought experiment. It's a pretty realistic thought experiment, right? Like, the most realistic predictor that I've read about is a psychological predictor who can read people's body language, maybe does secret research about people, in the way that mediums' husbands used to go out and kind of like do a bit of secret research on people. And you know, she's had this success in the past. So you know, that's quite plausible. And as a thought experiment in game theory, well, it's a pretty plausible thought experiment, you know, full stop, actually. I mean, thought experiments often involve, in philosophy, might involve things like faster than light travel, which are probably not possible. Whereas a 70% psychological predictor is I don't know, it doesn't seem that implausible to me. And I'll put a reference down below to a discussion which mentions that idea of a psychological predictor. There are also more science fiction type ideas of the predictor, but I think that this is a fairly realistic thought experiment. It's not pie in the sky, so don't kind of wander off or turn off the video because you just think this stuff's, you know, unrealistic. It sounds pretty realistic, at least on face value. Okay, so we get a split between dominance and expected utility, and we can understand how this works. It's like, well, you know, the money's there for the taking, two boxing, but on the other hand, we might want to trust the predictor, one boxing. And there's been several straw polls taken, and a weird thing that happens is that it's around 50-50. Around 50% of people will one box and trust the predictor, and around 50% will two box and try to get that extra 1,000. And both sides seem to think the other side's nuts. So that's your two options anyway. You one box, according to the rules of the game, you one box B, trusting the predictor and hoping that the million will therefore be in there. Or you two box and go for the extra 1,000 that you don't want to leave on the table. Now, in terms of the discussion of Newcomb's problem. It became actually quite popular even outside professional academic philosophical circles, which was Robert Nozick's area of activity, due to an article by Martin Gardner in 1974 in the Scientific American. So Martin Gardner used to always have a mathematical game in the Scientific American, and his March 1974 mathematical game was Newcomb's problem, and it was so popular that there was just like tons of letters being sent into the Scientific American, and it entered popular consciousness. However, the next step in the discussion goes back into university circles, and it's safe to say it was spearheaded by a guy called David Lewis. He was associated with North American universities. He also used to come out to Australian universities, which is where I'm shooting this vlog. And he was instrumental, let's say. That's not a good word. He was crucial in rephrasing the problem in terms of evidential decision theory versus causal decision theory, or EDT versus CDT. Let's get rid of the acronyms. Maybe David Lewis spent too much time at the ANU. He did spend some time there, which is in Canberra, which is kind of like the acronym capital of Australia and probably the world. Another story. So I'm going to say causalism versus evidentialism. Evidentialism is recommends one boxing. Causalism, as a decision theory, recommends two boxing. So we've got two different approaches to decision theory and to Newcomb's problem. Okay, what does this mean? Let's unpack. Let's get some goon since we're the punk philosopher. Goon. Okay, so evidentialism is the idea that, look, hey, we want to be objective about what our prospects are. So we want to hear good news about our choices, okay, or the choices of people we care about. And one way this might work out in terms of Newcomb's problem is that imagine you played a Newcomb's game, and that's what I'm going to be saying here, that a Newcomb's game where you're the agent perhaps, and the predictor is the person who puts the money in or doesn't in box B. You play a Newcomb's game and then you get amnesia. Anyway, someone says to you, hey, look, mate, before you had the amnesia, you played Newcomb's game, and you go, oh, really? What did I do? Did I one box, just box B, going for the million and trusting the predictor, or did I two box? And bloke goes, well, mate, you one boxed. And you go, oh, beauty. That means I probably got $1 million, and I'm going to go down to my bank now, because if I've got $1 million playing the Newcomb's game, I would put it in my bank, and I'm probably going to find, wow, that my bank balance is $1 million. And evidentialism suggests that, says that, if that's what happened, then that shows that that's the best choice. That's good news that you made that choice. Now, causalism is different. Causalism says, it's not just about acting on objective evidence. It's about you trying to grab something for yourself, right? There's a subjective element to it too, right? And so it's kind of a, loosely speaking, a sort of Nietzschean aspect to causalism. Like you're trying to get something for yourself, and so you're putting into you're initiating a causal sequence which will lead to a superior outcome. Now, usually, causalism and evidentialism don't come apart. Like, let's say that there's a best bet in terms of a horse race, right, or a greyhound race, and you learn that someone you care about, or you learn that you've made that best bet, and that's good news. Well, then also you've been a causalist because you would have initiated the causal sequence of attaining the superior outcome by actually placing the bet as well as assessing the evidence that it's good news that you place that bet. But in the case of Newcomb's problem, things are a little bit different. And the reason is that with the causalist idea is that the causalist says, well, hang on, how can it be the case that if I two-box, that box B is going to be empty? Like, what are the causes that are going to lead to that? Okay. And that's a really good question, because the causes, look, you can start getting into the idea of what you mean by cause, and indeed David Lewis did do this as a way of preparing his kind of causalist crusade, we might say. But I'm the punk philosopher, and one of my favourite weapons of choice is the Sword of Alexander, which cuts the Gordian knot of unnecessary conversation. And so we can kind of simplify here and just put it like this. The way in which two boxing will lead to box B being empty is if the predictor, when you two box, decides to make sure that box B is empty. Now, this raises a very important aspect of the Newcomb's game, which I should have mentioned before. The predictor cannot change the allocation of the money on the basis of your decision to one box or two box. So, in that case, she can't decide to not put the $1 million in box B on the basis that you have two boxed. But then, wow, I mean, what could the other causal, whatever we mean by cause, what could the other causal relations be that mean that two boxing leads to the emptiness of box B? And they just don't really seem to be any. Okay, you might say, well, what about the predictor's past success? Well, you know, that could just be a fluke, like tossing heads 5 times in a row. Okay, and to go with the fluke is the gambler's fallacy, and I'll put a link down below to what's meant by the gambler's fallacy. Or it might be the case that you get browbeaten by the predictor, who's like, yeah, I know what you're going to do, so you better one box. But that's not a rational form of decision making either, right? And again, I don't agree with Nietzsche's ideas about everything reducing, truth reducing to the assertion of will, and in fact game theory doesn't agree with it either. Game theory is about what's right, or what's a right or wrong decision to make, rather than asserting on the basis of what you want what's a right or wrong decision to make. But maybe we could say that Nietzsche would be right to say, hey, you should have some respect. Let's get browbeaten by the predictor, and it doesn't seem like a rational thing to do, just to be browbeaten by the predictor, and therefore one box if that motivation for one boxing accounts for some of the predictor's success. So in that case, causalism can say, look, you should two box. So again, causalism and evidentialism seem to come apart in the case of a Newcomb game, whereas they don't seem to come apart normally as in the case of a horse bet, where, say, for instance, as mentioned, the good news that you've bet on the best horse is also it coincides with your action of causally placing the bet. Now, the problem arises for evidentialism that when the two come apart, it seems like causalism is kind of the better option. And this was the basis of David Lewis's Causalist crusade in favour of two-boxing. And to understand this, imagine that, like, I'm concerned about global climate change, right? But instead of doing anything about global climate change, I bribe a journalist to say global climate change is a load of bollocks. This isn't unknown, by the way. So then I'm sitting in my lounge room and I turn on my radio and on comes that journalist and she says, global climate change is a load of bollocks. And I go, oh, phew, thanks for that. But then a couple of months later, it's late February, early March 2022, and I'm in Brisbane or I'm in Lismore, especially Lismore, and suddenly I'm hit with an extreme weather event that was not supposed to arrive for another 20 years, according to people who aren't so hip to global climate change. And the reason that that's happened is, of course, is that I haven't taken any causal steps to mitigate global climate change. I've just paid a journalist to manage the news about global climate change. So it looks like managing the news and evidentialism, when it comes apart from causalism, is kind of a bit daft. Now, it comes apart from causalism in the case of the Newcomb's paradox and a problem. I'll earn the right to call it a paradox shortly. In the case of Newcomb's problem. And so, as a result, it looks like causalism and two-boxing is the right way to go. Okay, now, that David Lewis's Causalist crusade did mean that, perhaps a clearer way of saying this, that within certain academic circles, that two-boxing gains a little bit of popularity. I'll put a link to a poll that was done more recently. So David Lewis's Causalist crusade happened in the mid to late 70s, and I'll put a link to a poll that's been done more recently, and also Martin Gardner's articles also induced a poll and encouraged a poll to take place. And what the polls basically say is that it's kind of 50-50. 50% of people one box and 50% of people two box. And the one boxers think the two boxes are nuts and two boxers think the one boxers are nuts. So that didn't really change that much, but in some circles, Lewis had some success. However, Lewis was a very devoted philosopher and an honest man, and he had to admit that there was a problem with his causalist two-boxing strategy. And he had a slogan where he admitted this, where he said, "Why ain't you rich?" Now, the idea here is that, well, according to what we've been told about the game, the Predictor has got a pretty good track record. So, you're probably going to miss out on the 1 million. And Lewis admitted that. But Lewis said, well, look, those riches are reserved for the irrational. Now, this is a kind of a funny response. And one reason why is because, well, which will become relevant here is that what rationality is about in the case of a Newcomb's game is actually about gaining the riches. So to say the riches are reserved for the irrational seems to be missing the boat a little bit. Now, as a result of this, already by 1981, a guy called Levi had talked about Newcombmania, and what he meant by that was that Lewis hadn't really managed to carry the day, and that there was still a lot of discussion going on around Newcomb's problem and around causalism and evidentialism. And there's all sorts of things you can do. You can maybe try to suggest that causalism can be one boxing and so on. And I'll put a link down to a relatively recent book which covers all of this kind of all of these sort of shenanigans. In terms of vlogging, which I'm interested in, I'm not just interested in university academic life as a punt philosopher. I'm also interested in what people are saying in a more popularist context, because I believe that that universities should be negated by being realised, that critical thought should be everywhere. There's been a return back to one boxing, and especially with vloggers like Kane B and Friction. And I'll link a couple of their vlogs below. There's a really good 3-hour vlog if you're a total Newcomb's nut, where it's more like a podcast really, because they don't use the visual element, even less than me. But they basically both agree on one boxing, on account of the fact that they want the money, right? And it's kind of funny actually, because there's a point at which Kane B, who's British, is sort of talking in pounds, and Friction, who's North American, is talking in terms of dollars. We'll come back to that because it's not entirely irrelevant. So there's been certainly a popular move back to one boxing, and certainly doesn't seem to have been any kind of academic agreement that, for instance, Lewis hoped to facilitate with his move towards two boxing. And it's kind of easy to understand why, right? Like, on the one hand, you do want to trust the predictor, and you do think, well, if she's so great, probably the million is going to be in there. But on the other hand, you can just see that extra 1,000 and grab it. And one idea that has also come up in the vlogs is that maybe what's happening here is that both are right. Now, there's a vlogger called Vsauce2 who has basically said this, and he hasn't really argued it, but he's much smicker than the punk philosopher, and I think what he did is bold and good, and I'm going to actually try and sort of defend with a little bit more detail the idea that, in fact, it's not just Newcomb's problems, it's Newcomb's paradox. That is, both one and two boxing are right. Now, what would it mean if both one and two boxing are right? Well, it would mean that one boxing and not one boxing were right, so P and not P, so contradiction, or two boxing and not two boxing were right, so Q and not Q, a contradiction. Interesting the way the contradiction already seems to kind of spread and take a couple of different forms, and I'll come back to that. But certainly we have a contradiction here around the idea that singularity and multiplicity are in logical opposites, and that if we pair them we get a contradiction, and that's a contradiction which goes actually right back to a guy called Parmenides. I'll put a link below to him, and he probably got it from almost definitely got it from Eastern sources, Indian philosophy probably. So it's an old contradiction, and it's and it is a contradiction if both one and two boxing are right. Why would we believe that? Well, I guess there's a couple of reasons why. I mean, I've already talked about this sort of intuitive reason where you're faced with the Newcomb's. We're playing the Newcomb's game, and both are attractive. And I've already talked about how there seems to be this roughly 50-50 split overall, between one boxing and two boxing. But there's also the case of the 100% predictor, which I think suggests that what we're looking at with a Newcomb's game is the production of a genuine contradiction. So if you when the idea of a 100% correct predictor was first mooted, and I'll put a reference below, it was thought that it's just like taking items off a menu, like either you want $1,000 or you want $1 million, right? Like, because the predictor's 100% right. But that's not actually the case, right? Even if the predictor does put the money, the 1 million in box B, it's still open to you by the rules of the game to 2 box, even if the predictor is God. And I'll put a reference down to a couple of Jewish philosophers who have the predictor, who move towards the end of their article in the direction of thinking of the predictor in terms of being an Abrahamic God. Quite an early article on the matter, actually. So this tends to suggest that, yeah, there's a real contradiction here that maybe both are right. Because, even if the predictor's infallible, then, wow, you can still go either way. The idea of an infallible predictor is probably not realistic. I'll put a reference down to why not. But nevertheless, pushing things to this limit of the infallible predictor is indicative of why we might be confronted with a genuine paradox. Now, J.L. Mackie, he wrote an article where he suggested that while it was a hard choice to make, that it was simply a problem where you had to figure out what was the right choice, and that was different to a paradox where both are the right choice. And so I basically think J.L. Mackie is wrong. I put a reference down to his article below. I think we are actually entitled to talk about Newcomb's paradox from now on in. Newcomb's paradox arises out of a Newcomb's game rather than simply just a Newcomb's problem. As I said, this is what Vsauce 2, a very popular vlogger. He's got I think almost 2 million views for his Newcomb vlog. Now that doesn't make his arguments right. So what a number of a high number of views doesn't endorse a philosophical position. You need arguments for it. So why should we expect, beside the sort of case of the 100% predictor, that or how can we explain that a paradox has arisen here? I mean, if you take a paradox like the extended life paradox, which is something like this sentence is false, okay, it's a paradox of self-reference where language can refer to itself, and you can make it refer to itself in a way which contradicts itself. But I'm not that great a logician, but I can't see that that's what's happening here. So I'm interested in another explanation for why it's the case that a Newcomb's game produces a Newcomb's paradox. And I think it's to do with the nature of money itself. Because remember, we've got monetary amounts here. So in order to show why I think this, I'm going to replace the monetary amounts with use values. So in box B, I'm going to put some shampoo. In box A, I'm going to put some shampoo. And in box B, I'm going to put the life jacket. The life jacket doesn't really fit in box B, but the whistle does, for attracting the attention of sharks. Old aircraft stewardesses joke there. And we can say that if you get the whistle, you get the whole thing. If there's no whistle, you don't get anything. And the agent can't see whether the whistle's in there or not. Currently it is in there. Now, all of a sudden there's no problem or there's no paradox. Well, why not? Well, because once you introduce use values, you introduce context and you introduce an interaction with the context, and you just, on that basis, decide what you want. So, for example, if you're on the Titanic and the Titanic's going down, you would certainly one box, because you don't really need to, you don't care about also shampooing your hair. You just want to save your sorry little ass. So you'd certainly one box. On the other hand, if you're in Alice Springs, which is a desert city in the centre of Australia where shampoo's hard to get and your hair dries out and you don't need a life jacket, you'd two box. And then you could give the life jacket to someone who lived in Brisbane or Lismore, if you got the life jacket as well. So it seems like once we put use values into the boxes, the problem and the paradox disappears, because we start dragging in context and we start knowing exactly what it is we want. So my conclusion from this is that given that Newcomb's game gives rise to a Newcomb's paradox, that it's about the nature of money. Now, how can money introduce a paradox? Good question. Well, the funny thing about money is it's both useful and useless. Now, you're probably thinking, no, money's just really useful. But let's start with the idea that money is useless. Now, money, what is money? It's a means of payment, okay? But when we talk about payment, well, then that idea of payment's doing the explanatory lifting. What is payment? Well, payment's not barter, right? It's not, say, for instance, swapping one life jacket for, say, I don't know, 10 bottles of shampoo. Payment's a quantity only transaction. Now, how the hell can that work? Well, even with barter, there's got to be some kind of value that we can use to render things equivalent or quantitatively equivalent. That is, that 10 equals 1 or whatever. And so money is a quantity only idea of value. Now, what this value is, I'm not going to go into. I believe it to be congealed human labour in a broader natural context, but I'm not going to argue for that here, because I don't really think it's that necessary. But that is a way of understanding. I think that's the best way to understand how money works. It's a quantity only instantiation and measure of value. Now, you might say, well, hang on, gold isn't quantity only. It also was ductile and resistant to rust. And gold was money for a lot of empires, starting with Egyptian and Roman, Greek, Islamic empires, and continuing on right into the 19th century, when we started to move to a idea of paper money. Quite late in the 19th century, actually, if the truth be known. But once we start moving to paper money, it's because we're sort of excising the extraneous when it comes to money. We're trying to give money a form where it's a quantity only measure of value for exchange. Okay. Increasingly money became bills rather than coins. Bills aren't really useful for anything. I mean, you can see Tom Cruise's character in, I think it's called Tropic Thunder, snorting up cocaine with a rolled up bill, but you could snort up cocaine with any rolled up bit of paper, okay? And the bill doesn't have much use. For a while, bills were backed up by gold, but that's no longer the case. After about 1973, bills are backed up by entire economies and by the value set aside in those economies for circulation. And after about 1985, money started to digitise, and probably after about, maybe a little bit later than that, but money started to digitise, and now in 2024, money's just totally digital, and it just doesn't have any use as a digit, right? And yet that's the best form of money, because as the global economy has increasingly developed, you want to be able to shift vast amounts of money almost instantaneously around the globe. You don't really want to be strapping on sort of bills onto yourself and swimming into the Canary Islands or something, right? You just want to be able to electronically shift this money. So money as it took on its purest form, became useless. And yet, money is extremely useful. I mean, I could buy this house with money if I had enough of it, and then I could, I don't know, I'm a renter, but I could change the house around to suit my lifestyle and my uses. At this point, actually, I want to do the Dead Kennedy's joke, which is, because I'm talking about money, you might wonder why there's an S on my shirt. There you go. Money's the problem here. Now, you might say, well, look, is money really the problem? I mean, if you've got like a house, you just enjoy a house. But there doesn't seem to be any contradiction there, right? It just seems useful. But that's not exactly right, you know. Like say you've got a house, but you know, extreme weather event happens in that house, or World War III happens around that house, and then you can't really enjoy that house. You know, go, well, hang on, Jerry, hey, whoa, pun fosso, why are you bringing up World War III and global climate change? Like, what's that got to do with the price of tea in China, so to speak? And the answer is that, well, money is capable of this indefinite expansion, and given the capitalist context in which it has excised the extraneous and become this digitized representation, it demands this endless growth. You know, so you can imagine while you might only need one life jacket, and while you might only need one bottle of shampoo at a time, you know, you can imagine your bank balance adding up to billions, trillions. I mean, they talk about comets or asteroids worth quadrillions of dollars. Money's capable of this endless expansion, and given the capitalist economy, in which money has attained its purest form, it's not only capable of this endless expansion. That is demanded, and once that's demanded, you get the the environment buckling, on account of the fact that this endless exploitation takes place. And you get World War III on account of the fact that the different capitalists need to try and expand at the expense of each other. So what's happening there is that the contradiction that seems to be resolved just because I own a house is displaced somewhere else. And this is something that happens with contradictions. I'm going to say a little bit about contradictions here. I'll put a link below by a guy called Graham Priest. Now, the first thing to note is that usually in philosophy, you're not allowed to have contradictions. Okay, in classical logic, if you've got a contradiction, everything underwritten by that logic, any theory, including a theory of a Newcomb's game, underwritten by that contradiction is underwritten by that logic is trivial. So if you've got, say, P and not P, or Q and not Q, then you get S, where S is any statement. But apparent consistent logics, as have been developed over the last few decades, can block that inference and allow us to reason about contradictions without fear of triviality. And I'll put a link to Graham, the first edition of Graham Priest's book, In Contradiction, below, a reference to that. And then allow us to talk about dialetheas, real life contradictions, as I think is produced by a Newcomb's game, a Newcomb's paradox, a real life contradiction. Now, that idea of the real life contradiction as is discussed in Graham Priest's book, which also discusses the question of the paradoxes of self-reference, which I mentioned before, also talks about how if you try to suppress a contradiction in one place, then it appears somewhere else. And we can understand this in terms of kind of a web of belief. If you adjust your web of belief so your enjoyment of the house that you've purchased is apparently consistent, non-contradictory, then the contradiction appears somewhere else where the disutility of money on say, for instance, a bigger picture becomes evident. Pardon me. COVID. Okay. So why would I think that it appears in a Newcomb's game? Because that's what I think. But the contradiction that's displaced in our everyday use of money actually appears in Newcomb's game, which is a thought experiment in game theory. I mean, how does that work? Well, imagine this, right? As the global economy becomes more and more fast-moving, fast-paced, and offers more opportunities, you might find that there are two opportunities that are pretty much equal, right? One might be investment in, say, motorcycles, and the other might be, say, investment in motor cars. Now, motorcycles, let's say, have 2 wheels. That's what we mean by motorcycle. Car has 4 wheels, so 2 doesn't equal 4. So let's say both investment opportunities are going to pay off the same, and yet they're not the same. So 2 doesn't equal 4, and yet they're both good investments. Exactly equal investments, and this happens more and more as the global economy accelerates. Well, what I would put to you is that that's what's being expressed when both one boxing and two boxing are right. That same contradiction is coming out because monetary amounts are involved. And if you think about, say for instance, the equivalence of, say, investing in motorcycles 2 wheels or investing in cars 4 wheels, what happens is that you're converting your investment into money in order to reconvert it into more commodities and make more money. Okay, so so you've got 2 different ways of making money that aren't the same, because 2 doesn't equal 4, and yet they're both equally good ways of making money, and that's what's happening with Newcomb's paradox. Newcomb's paradox is a displacement into a game theoretic thought experiment of the destructive contradiction of money. I think that the apocalyptic examples that I have come up with are enough to suggest that this contradiction is not something we want. And therefore, I think that what the urgent lesson of Newcomb's paradox is that we have to abolish money. Now, there's all sorts of radicalism happening on the campuses at the moment, and it's great. It's the opposition, especially the opposition to the genocide in Gaza. It's great. But it's not enough. We need new ideas, not only on campus but also off campus. And the new ideas should be about how we can live without money and without the endless growth that money demands. And how we can live by thinking in terms of use values and not in terms of quantity only exchange that money promises. So that is the urgent lesson of Newcomb's paradox, that we abolish money. And I'm going to finish with a quote. It's from an Amerindian source, a North American Indian source. There's some disagreement as to what the source is. It could even come from before contacts with Europeans, in which case it's a sort of a warning, which is interesting and eerie. But either way, it's a great quote, and I'm going to end with it. When the last tree is cut down, the last fish is eaten, and the last stream is poisoned, you will realise that you cannot eat money. Thank you.